Good evening and welcome to another debate in this series, Culture for Climate. Today we will be discussing ecologies of care, resistance, strike and conservatism on intersections between culture and climate. My name is Małgorzata Miśniakiewicz. I'm a curriculum non-historian, and my four guests here are Rosario Talevi, Monika, Sadkowska, Edith, Jeřábková and Balša Lubarda. We will start the conversation with short presentations from each of the panelists. First is Rosario Talevi, who is a Berlin-based architect, a critical thinker, and a researcher involved with soft agencies and the floating university. Rosario, the floor is yours.
I'm on, no? Yes? Okay. Sorry, we've been doing this for many months and still strange to be in the computer. Thank you, Małgorzata, for the kind introduction and to the invitation to this panel. Today I will be sharing work on climate care, a research that engages with theory and practice at the intersection of climate challenges and ethics of care. I would like to share with you some images as I speak. This is a research that we have been conducting at the floating university. And it's a very special place. So I think it's really important to have the images supporting my statement. All right, so can you see it? Yes, thanks. Okay, great.
So good.
Thank you. Okay, so recently, Shannon Mattern has proposed that before maintenance can challenge innovation as the dominant paradigm, we'll need to build a bigger public stage. She argues that given the degree of brokenness of the broken world and the expense of fixing it, we need all maintainers to apply their diverse disciplinary methods and practical skills to the collective project of repair. In our work as soft agency, we respond to this challenge set forth by Shannon Mattern by reimagining systems and processes as an act of repair and not as an act of invention, to care for instead of getting rid of, to recuperate rather than replace, practicing curating as a critical spatial practice and applying ethics of care allow us to take on a site such as a floating university in Berlin, to examine its materiality and context, its political and social geography, and to act of those specific conditions. Our approach to programming at the floating was set on the site as the world in which we act, both the origin and the receiver of our intentions. Being on site at the floating university is being in nature, with all our senses, engaged and informed by the environment we inhabit. Being on site is being in interaction, and so we thought to employ that quality and express it through our curatorial programming. Under the title Climate Care, we curated a festival in 2019, which engages with theory and practices and the intersection of climate challenges and ethics of care. Emerging from weathering the condition of its sites, the program is a result of an in-depth cohabitation. While the climate crisis was featured in almost every mainstream news outlet in 2019, I want you to panic, if you remember, was perhaps one of the most quoted phrases from activist Greta Thunberg. There was a notable absence of theories of environmental justice or of discussion connecting this climate crisis with other intersecting social, racial, and political struggle. So we felt strongly that focusing on constructive forms of making and sharing was crucial in order to address such an overwhelming topic, and that by diverting our attention to the bonds we form with each other and with our environment, the current climate crisis could be infused with a sense of possibility. In this sense, we center Maria Puig de la Bella Casa notion of care, which provided us with an ethical and a political framework for action. Her notion of care reframes the human as a caretaker, a custodial figure in the ongoing recuperation of the panel and its people. To care, she says, is to recognize the fragility of the bonds between both humans and non-humans. And this practice of caring is asking us to cultivate a set of skills and sensibilities to maintain and sustain all kinds of lives. And all kinds of lives is coming from what John Tronto and Berenice Fischer stated back in the 1990s. And I quote, "Care is a specious activity that include everything that we do to maintain, continue, and repair our worlds so that we can live in it as well as possible. That world includes our bodies, ourselves, and our environment, all of which we seek to interweave in a complex life-sustaining web." In 2018, the Floating University was initiated by Raumlabor, a collective of architects in Berlin, as a temporary inner city laboratory for collective experiential learning and transdisciplinary exchange. The site, as you see it right now, is a fully functioning infrastructure. It was designed in the early 1930s as a water retention basin to serve the Tempelhof airfield and the adjacent avenues. And it has been closed off to the public for over 60 years. In this period of time, a diverse range of animals, plants, and algae have taken root and given birth to a unique landscape, a man-made environment reclaimed by nature, where polluted water coexists with the relatively new presence of this pedagogical experiment, forming what Donna Haraway coined as a nature cultures or the third landscape by Gilles Clement. After the Tempelhof airport closed in 2008, the city redevelopment plan proposed to relocate the basin as a pond within the field, surrounded by new development. However, in the Tempelhof referendum of 2014, Berliners voted against the city's plans and prevented any kind of construction of the airfields. This result of this referendum not only protected the unique inner city green space, but also has provided protection for this basin. And it is precisely in solidarity with the history of the place and with the lineage of alternative narratives for urban development that we situate our mission to open, maintain, and take care of this unique site, while bringing non-disciplinary, radical, and collaborative programs to the public. In other words, it is a place to learn to engage, to embrace the complexity and navigate the entanglements of the world, to imagine and to create different forms of living. Within this context, Climate Care, the program was curated to develop tools to work beyond crisis, using pre-existing and readily available networks and systems. Artists, designers were invited to propose educational modules that could encourage embodied and tacit knowledge to emerge from experiences on site. From compost making.
Sorry to interrupt. I just got a message from our interpreter. If you don't mind speaking slightly bit more slowly, because they can't catch up with you. Sorry for that.
No problem.
Thank you.
I was about to finish, but I was saying that from compost making to experimenting with biomaterial, with constructed urban hives, weather writing or tuning in methods, reading aloud together and looking at care at a planetary scale, the search for tools, methodologies, and processes was at the heart of Climate Care.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So many issues here. We'll get back to the discussion afterwards after we hear from each of you. So now, if I may ask you, Edith, to unmute yourself. Edith is a curator and art theorist based in Prague, and she is one of the founding members of ARE, but also of Institute for Anxiety and Woods. Rosario, if you don't know, if you could stop sharing your screen.
Sure.
Yep. Okay. So I'm going to share the screen for you, Edith, now.
Thank you. So hello, my dear colleagues, and hello, everybody. Can I speak already? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Okay. Hello, everybody, and thank you, Małgorzata, for inviting me today. I'm speaking from Woods, where I moved in permanently this year in order to try to live with rescued animals here and with a solar energy only. So you cannot see me in a full light. I'm sorry. And I hope the connection won't be terrible, which sometimes is. I will be speaking on behalf of Institute of Anxiety and the Woods, a community for cultivation, theory, and art. Both of them, I'm the founding member, as Małgorzata mentioned. We are based in Prague, and if this is any relevant information these days, and in the woods of Orlické Mountains, which is like 2 hours from Prague or like 3 hours from Wrocław, heading south. This year, I decided to move to the forest and try to keep my curatorial and academical work going on, which is an exciting experiment to me, since the energy is quite limited, and there are a lot of demands from my garden and few animals we have rescued this year and last year from the battery cage farms, goats and chicken. So let me introduce briefly the Institute of Anxiety. We decided with my colleagues, curator Zuzana Blochova and artists Eva Koťátková and Barbara Kleinhamplová, to study the anxiety throughout various formats of interdisciplinary practice and connect fields which are still missing communication, not only in on a general scale, but also personal. We took the ambivalent format of an institute for our common practice, which is kind of paradoxical given what the institute does. But we intended to talk about the needs of deinstitutionalization, unlearning, and re-evaluating of cultural and educational practice, and its changed and even new conditions. Yet we do not want to hunt the institutions, rather we want to cooperate under different contracts and suppress the old models of representation. We like to intervene with other collectives, communities, institutions, as well as individuals in more kinship manner. We are also part of the feminist art institution with its ethics, and we perceive this interconnection as a more organic way of working than to confine ourselves to some stronghold defending of our long-term goals. We cooperate with a number of other organizations, whether artistic or otherwise, and these forms of joint work, connection, and institutional empathy give us meaning in those particular steps that help us overcome the ubiquitous crisis, the small fear of Anthropocene preachers, media constructed apathy from climate change and political populism and nationalism. We treat the anxiety more as a social problem and as a force which gives us a space to connect and act together. Linking the art world with activism helps us to be more specific. Art often abstracts, generalizes, theorizes, symbolizes, but in connection with activism, it can be more clear of who is talking about what, from what experience, place, at what time. It is extremely important today to distinguish and be aware of the details, not just to universal. Although we keep talking about one planet and its crisis, we are not interconnected, at least not in that sociosphere. Deinstitutionalization, psychiatric ethos, unlearning, critical pedagogy, peer-to-peer practice, search for systematic alternatives, but also care for individual voices or those which are not heard. These are the main topics of Institute of Anxiety. And then when I speak of behalf of Woods, a community for cultivation, theory and art, which is part of the Institute of Anxiety, I have to mention that we are concerned with the ethics of agricultural practice and the capitalist abuse of the soil. We all know from our hearts, from Silvia Federici, from Peter Linnebo, and many others, that land should not have stayed, land should have stayed in people's possession. It should not be owned privately, as we learned from history events. And today's witch hunting practices in Africa. Yet we decided to buy a piece of land, about 3 acres of woods and meadow, to make more permanent and continuous effort in our learning processes. We all hope we will not fall in a trap by this property holding. After several years of working in culture exclusively, organizing exhibitions, talks, creating new art formats, mediating theories, and we felt like we are losing the very base. Me particularly, I felt like we are the last generation who, in broader sense, grew up with land. During the Czechoslovak normalization was very common that people had their own small food production going, or our grandparents had. So we knew the magic performed by planted seeds and eating vegetable straight from the garden bed or fruits from trees. So in Woods, we want to interconnect the diverse formats of knowledge about what land is. Therefore, we entered a wood society. With our first symposium we organized last year with the title "We Are Woods, the Intelligence of Plants and Interspecies Communication," where we discussed, performed, eat and walked the problems connected with species hierarchy and entered the complicated system of interdigestion circle. This year's symposium, Resist Like Woods, we borrowed ideas from Michael Muller's essay, Resist Like a Plant, where he recognizes how civil expressions of disobedience and protests against the present market economy take on the form of vegetal cooperation and resistance. How movements like Occupy choose sedimentary forms of protest, being in a location, sitting on the ground in a human chain, formed by connecting limbs that evoke the occupation of a place, physically growing into it, rather than a desire for violent confrontation, the animal model of resistance. Direct physical presence without any form of representation expresses in the most physical form of presentation the demand for a sustainable social order. The resistance of forest guilds can be exemplary in how the forest tries to cover the planet's surface, occupy empty spaces, and protect the life-giving soil layer by its perseverance. It still has this ability despite the advancing drought. Nevertheless, human work wins in the massive deforestation of the forest growth, using the heavy technology of advanced harvesting whose movement in the forest also causes water to drain from the harvested areas and the erosion of dry, exposed soil. So we invited to the woods people of forest, plant and interspecies communities, experts in forestry, soil management and landscape disciplines, curators, artists, activists to talk, observe and relax within the program of lectures, forest cinema, reading, meditation, story sharing, cooking, performance, concert and exhibition. In today's era of climatic, political, social and medical instability, resistance has become one of the primary means for ameliorating and slowing down the destructive consequences of human activity. The fragility of the balanced communities that we have disrupted is coming back to us in a form of species extinction, the breakdown of autoimmune and landscape systems, dehydration, erosion, pandemic, and more. We do not see this to be only a consequences of human activities, but rather a new market models of new form of colonization. Long time I have the intensive feeling that soon we will, in the name of old dichotomies, south, north, east, west, left, right, divide into the space people and the earth people. We can see that already, how the space people compete, who will colonize the space and virtual environment first and how. Post-human capitalism is establishing a new production of life. Life itself becomes a product and profit. Lives of species became products of new technological market. Either we talk about cloning or artificial intelligence. First, we have to extinct the species, save their DNA, and then create them and sell them with nostalgic surcharge. In woods, we believe in nature culture, permaculture, diversity and sustainability of land, food production culture. We would like to create a nursery for plants and mushrooms for the dry and deforested times and animals of higher variety with focus on insect and animals and maintain the face-to-face communication with us humans. Thank you.
Thank you, Edith. So many things. Again, before we dive in, although there are so many interesting overlaps with Edith and Rosario's talks, even in terms of the sort of spaces you choose and occupy. But let's get to that later, because now we'll hear from Monika Sadkowska. Monika is an activist, a performer, a singer, and an organizer. She co-organized the first climate camp in Poland, and she's co-founder of a climate choir. So, Monika.
Thank you very much, Małgorzata. Thank you for having me here. I'm really, that's a big event for me. Thank you very much. Although I don't have a presentation, so I hope it will be not boring. If I should speak slower, just let me know, please. Because when I'm getting too excited, you know what happens. So, well, yes, I used to be an actress. I used to be a singer, and 4 years ago, I just became an activist. And now I'm working in Client Earth. This is quite serious organization. And after work, yeah, it's true. I'm still. It still happens to me to have a romance with art. So maybe I will, Małgorzata told me that the most interesting thing would be climate camp in Poland, first climate camp, and the climate choir. So I will begin with climate camp. It's so great to see all these practices you've mentioned before me. It was so interesting because somehow in 2018 we were thinking about this reunion with nature when we were preparing climate camp. We get 500 people. It was the first climate camp, so we took 500 people from Poland to lakes and we organized there absolutely everything that we could imagine. So there were a lot of talks, a lot of speakers talking about science, about energy, and a lot of artists. And it was actually the first time in Poland when we were thinking about interest to make artists in Poland interested in climate, and in very particular case, it was a case of brown coal, which is very destructive for water sources everywhere where are lignite mining. Water scarcity is actually present there also. So we took 500 people from cities, from big cities prevalently, and they realized that there are some lakes, and these lakes are actually disappearing because of lignite. The year after, in 2019, it happens the first civil disobedience act made grassroots, because we have, of course, civil disobedience acts in Poland, but they were usually organized by bigger organizations. But this was the first climate disobedience first civil disobedience climate action. We were blocking the lignite mine, and the 2020 this year happens the same thing, despite the pandemic. So it was a quite big event. So a lot of began during this climate camp. This was a huge networking situation, and I'm sure that all these events that you are preparing also have this networking dimension. Many people I'm observing now in NGOs and in grassroots movements met during the first climate camp. And the second thing is a climate choir. We live in Warsaw. It's 20 people, and we began to meet during pandemic in March. So first our first rehearsals were on Zoom. So as you can imagine, it was very, very funny and very, very chaotic. And we had a text. It was a text that I prepared. It was I'm an author of the text, and Aleksandra Gryka, who is a composer, classic music composer, let's say modern music composer. Yeah. So she wrote the partiture, music partiture to this text, and we invited 20 people to sing, to shout, to scream, to beatbox, and this short text became a 13 minutes piece of music. Actually, it would be better to say maybe performance. And our original aim was to perform it on the streets. It was to perform it in metro, in tube, or in very different places that are not used to be scene of the performances. So on the bank of the river, in the middle of the place in Warsaw, which is where are only big buildings with corporate buildings, and because of pandemic, actually we cannot perform, and our aim is to go to the studio and to record our piece. But we hope that after pandemic we could actually perform on the streets as it was planned. The piece has only 13 minutes because we were thinking about catching people in the middle of their lives, in the middle of travel between point A and point B. And we were thinking that it's 13 minutes, it's just like enough time for a person to just stop, to watch and go farther. Even this 13 minutes could be very, very long and too long for everybody. But we perform it 3 or 4 times usually when we used to perform it, because we wanted to give this experience that you can actually start hearing, to listen at the piece from no matter which point of the partiture of the piece, and to finish it when the loop will close. Yes. So apparently this is it. One very important aim for me in this practice, in this event, was to just relax after work, because my job usually every day actually is to read reports, to think about what big energy companies in Poland have in mind and what they plan, and why don't they think about climate, and why do they want to make still more money instead of protecting our future. So after job like that, I wanted to find my shelter in art. So I came back somehow to my previous profession, to make this choir. And what I've learned during these 4 years, it sounds only 4 years, but actually it was a long time, that I wanted to test what I've learned, and I wanted to test during this event, this artistical event, was to speak to people in the big city with care and with respect, even if we are all somehow responsible for the situation. Some of us are capitalist. I would say that everybody are actually capitalists living in such a rich country like Poland, and in such a city like Warsaw. We are all capitalists somehow. We have huge carbon footprint, even if we don't want to. So to recognize this truth, that everybody are somehow the enemy of our Mother Earth, and it is not okay. But we should mention it at the beginning and stop to blaming each other. And the first words of this piece is "I'm sorry." It would be better to say "excuse me." In Polish language is actually the same word, but the meaning is like double. So we didn't want to preach people, but we want to say to them, yeah, we are also ashamed. We are also guilty. But let's look at the situation and let's try to find the better emotions in us, just to remember that there is still something that we care for, that we have energy in, and with this energy and with this care, we can try to fight together. And the form of choir was important for me because this is an example of cooperating. Most of people, these 20 people, are amateurs. Some of them are actors, some of them are singers, but amateur singers. And the form which Aleksandra Gryka, the composer, proposed is very inclusive. So we really think about making this choir much, much bigger and to perform after pandemic in the strangest places you can imagine. So I think that's from me, and I'm really curious of questions.
Thank you, Monika. Last but not least, Balša. I apologize already for the situation where you being the only male are requested to represent the probably a bit more theoretical position and about your research. Balša is an environmental sociologist, and he's the head of ideology research unit at the Center for Analysis of the Far Right. And that's going to speak to us right now. Sorry, Balša is at the Central European University. Balša, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Małgorzata, and thank you all for these very inspiring outlooks on how we can address part of the change we're experiencing. Now, my account is not going to be as inspiring. Apologies, I'm afraid, but it is what it is, I guess. So in the invitation for today's talk, I was expected to give my 2 cents on the term ecofascism, a term which I have a huge beef with. And I will, of course, explain to you why that is. And of course, I was also asked to share some of my insights from the fieldwork that I conducted with far-right organizations, radical right and nationalist organizations in Hungary and Poland, but also in the other countries of the region, the V4 region, so Czech Republic and Slovakia, and also some work in Italy. And academics, as you may know, are very interested in how this act of labeling things, so how we want to sort of call things that we engage with, as this mere act of labeling bestows authority and essentially defines the debate and defines the scope of the debate and where this debate is supposed to go. And something which all of us interested in environmental and climate change are more or less inclined towards, in that we all recognize that these things matter. The conceptual demarcations, of course, may seem futile and unimportant in the real world. So whether we're calling something eco-fascism or we're calling it far-right ecologism, as I suggest, that may not be as important in the actual practice, whatever the practice entails. But I think that the frames operate in an unconscious manner, and not only that I think, but it is a fact. And therefore, we have to really worry about and, of course, engage with the ways in which we label things. Now, to return to the eco-fascism, the notion that I have a beef with, it is, of course, based on the intricate link between the blood and the soil, the Blut und Boden, the conveying a spiritual and deterministic link based on some ethno-nationalist terms between the human being on one hand and the environment in which the human being was based. So the spirit of the culture soaked in the land, the spirit of that human being is this general idea upon which eco-fascists base their ideological position. Now, the general history lesson on eco-fascism would narrate it. It would go along the lines of eco-fascism having originated in vitalist philosophy and its spiritual underpinnings of 19th century conservation movements, some parts of the conservation movements, which were more close to Germany and to the German tradition of environmental thinking. Again, we're talking about some of the fringe right-wing movements, and some would even actually say that Ernst Haeckel, the person who coined the term ecology, can be considered an example of this folkish nationalist strand of thinking. These arguments, again, this usual historical boring storyline would go that such sentiments went from the fringe to mainstream with the advent of fascism. So speaking of Mussolini's Italy, which brought back the idea of the religion of nature, consisting of this primeval Teutonic nature mysticism, the idea of going back to the land, cultivating the land. So that is one example of Mussolini's Italy, but we could also talk about German anti-humanist and the Nazi era, which was also very much based on such ideas, even though they in fact existed also more on the fringe. So figures like Voltaire there, the Nazi Minister of Agriculture, who was a proponent of organic farming, they all invoke such conceptual ideas. Now, again, to follow that historical, general historical narrative, is that these ideas peaked sometime, of course, with the end of the World War II, the Second World War. And after that, something like eco-fascism is not really there to be found. And the problem is, I guess, that if we think of it that way, it is historically misleading. It is very difficult for us to find where eco-fascism is today. Another problem I have with eco-fascism, and why I think we should be going for something broader, is that it is conceptually misleading, because it is eco-fascism as such, and eco-fascist movements do exist today, but they are rather secondary to the existing engagement of far-right, say, organizations, far-right parties and movements with environment. A lot of these ideations are not necessarily fascist. They are building on an idea of green conservatism, and I'm glad that conservatism was mentioned. Of course, not necessarily in that political sense, but ideologically speaking, it definitely matters. So ecofascism is also obfuscating a profound, very historical and conceptual linkage, which has been around for a very long time between the far right and the environment. And another problem is that such links are fairly wide to be captured, and this is something we sort of need to keep in mind. So ecofascists like to talk about the connection between the land and the race, to talk about say pollution being the preface to eradicate the white race, things like that. They call for the abolition of vivisection, support for veganism, etc., etc. So we can find quite a few animal welfare advocates among those who we would consider eco-fascists. But the point is that they exist in the fringe. Not all far-right members are into eco-fascism, yet they can be ecologists. Now, just to break down this conundrum, which can be rather confusing, conceptually speaking, as I may assume, I will offer three snapshots, three very short stories about the people I actually encountered and that represent this breadth of eco-fascism. And all three are, you guess, from the Polish context and represent members of various members of Polish nationalist organizations. And I'm doing this, I just want to disclose this, that I'm doing this in a very selective and ultimately a superficial manner, for which I apologize. And I apologize to the respondents even, because I am running the risk of presenting the incomplete picture. Yet there are some elements that I found very characteristic of these three very different strands of far-right ecologism that I want to represent through these three stories. Very short ones, so don't worry. The first one is a story about a young guy whom I will call Maciej, a young male from Szczecin, who was a former member of autonomous nationalists. And he can be considered the prime representative of what eco-fascism is today. He's a young man. He was in early 20s back when we met, and it was 2 years ago. And we spent a very long day in the nature, so to speak. So outside, again, I hate this imaginary dichotomy, but we really spoke about his ecological activism, aside to his very clear ideological position. One thing that was particularly striking to me is that when we met, Rex wore a very Maciej wore a very specific T-shirt, which had written, and you may guess this, some of you who are maybe more familiar with far-right circles, it had the white race T-shirt with the North Face logo on it, and it is rather unambiguous, speaking in terms of his ideological position. Yet he seemed to be in flux when he talked about his past, his ideological past, and there seemed to have been sort of a discontent with where he stands ideologically. But enough about Maciej. To turn to the second figure that I assume the Poles here at least are more familiar with, Krzysztof Bosak, the former presidential candidate from Ruch Narodowy or Konfederacja Coalition, is obviously a story of that is entirely different to that of Maciej. Krzysztof Bosak's outlook on the environment was very much in line with the idea of eco-modernization. His crisp answers to all of my queries were somewhat evoking this cost-benefit analysis. Whenever I would ask a question, the answer would be offering what the good sides and the downsides of a particular ecological policy are. So one thing that I found very particular in his account was that he clearly wanted to distinguish, he considers himself an ecologist, but he wants to distinguish himself from those that he calls eco-terrorists, those that are essentially radical ecologists in his view. So there is also a different side of the coin, entirely different from the first one that you heard. And the third story that I want to offer to this table, the virtual one, is about Alicia, who is a young female member of ONR, another nationalist organization, who is also one of the most invested respondents that I had thus far, invested in local environmental activism. I will not share with you, for the sake of anonymity, where she's from, but I can assure you that together with her fellow nationalists, and not only nationalists, she has been a member of various local environmental networks, especially those that were even associated with grassroots. Again, for the sake of anonymity, I cannot mention the initiatives, but she has helped raising funds for lots of environmental causes, so to speak, including animal welfare issues. But she also has protested against illegal lodgings, etc., etc. So shows sort of an example of perhaps even the gender perspective that one needs to take into account, because that one was very interesting in that whole encounter. To bring the question of relevance, and maybe to present this as a few points of departure instead of a conclusion. Why this matter? Why should we even talk about far-right ecologism? The answer that I want to offer is the good old ghosts of the past, which have never really been ghosts and have never really been a part of the past. I argue. Far-right ecologism, on one hand, is knocking on the doors of biological determinism and organicism, which has been mentioned thus far. And they have been prominent features of 19th century sociology. It is a legacy of sociology that we just have to live with, I guess. In eugenic projects of racial hygiene, in waves of resistance to what we know as social demands, etc., etc. So contemporary environmental movement, the one that we know now, when we now think of environmentalists, we think of a sharp discontinuity with such thinking, and that's the problem. Is that these values are very alive and well, although they do exist on the fringe, much as they existed on the fringe in the 19th century or even the 20th. So if you think why this matters, or if you're still asking yourself why this matters, I can give a very concrete example, and that is the ongoing pandemic. Ask yourself, perhaps, how many people that you know shared messages such as "nature is healing, we are the virus," or how many people you know argued for lifting the lockdowns, and not only the lockdowns, but all the relevant measures to give space for the natural process of death to come in, speaking basically about all the elderly population. You know, they have to die, they should die, speaking in those terms. How many people you know that believe that overpopulation is a very valid problem on a global scale? And to be honest, I hope maybe you don't know anyone, but I do. And if you don't, I have to say that I'm very happy for you in this case. But the point is, these people do exist, and such messages get very easily shared, even by those who are not necessarily far-right ecologists or eco-fascists. So to say that, you know, for me, seeing people like Bosak championing environmental causes definitely doesn't seem very likely to happen in the near future. But at the same time, somewhat younger far-right activists, people like Rex and Alicia, Matti and Alicia, are finding new ways to address these issues. And in doing so, they're able to permeate local environmental networks and what we would understand as mainstream or grassroots forms of environmentalism. Again, those two may not be necessarily overlapping. And my point is that if we want to actually tackle this issue, we need to stop, you know, spreading this moral panic and actually face the problematic legacy of early environmental thought, which still exists, again, on the fringe. The ingrained, the taken for granted assumptions that we have about our own righteousness. And I assure you that this process will be a particularly uneasy endeavor. However, without coming to terms with that fascist in us, with these, you know, sharing such posts that can point to a very slippery slope of you know, posts such as "we are the virus, nature is healing," and essentially misanthropic attitudes, we again, run the risk of being not only superficial, but we tend to sort of ultimately fail to understand how these people perceive environment and what are the potential counter narratives that we can develop. Thank you, and I again will use these points of departure. Looking forward to your questions and the wider discussion.
Thank you, Balša. So I think it's time for us to start the conversation. So many questions. I think the first thing I'd like to start with is something you've already mentioned. So the gendering of environmental issues. Many of us speak about ethics of care as an instance of or a characteristic that is close to feminism or the feminist values of care and supporting life, for example. I know that in Monika, in your choir, there is a big majority of women. In the films and photographs we've seen from Rosario and Edith, it seems like there is, again, in terms of who are the participants, women seem to be the majority. And yet, when you, on the examples you, Balša, mentioned, this is the sort of gendering that we're used to think that the far right is the masculine, about the strength and not about maintaining life, it's about destruction and crumpling. So I wanted to ask all of you if you could share your views about those gender contexts of ecologies and the understanding of feminist futures, or how the ethics of care relates to what you're doing in these gendered terms. Would anyone like to start?
I can probably start. I think for us together, I work in this project with Gili Karjewski. For us, ethics of care has been, let's say, a theory that has supported our practice. So all of this feminist thought and that comes from the 60s, right? From departing from the 60s, has been essential to support us as practitioners, as to understand what we do and then apply this ethics of care in practice. Yeah, I would probably, the gendering aspect, I think I would challenge, because this is what the feminists already did, right? As saying this is not, of course, it's not something that it's a feminine thing to do, right? What I see, at least in my organization, is definitely in the events that we do on site, it's mainly women taking part, but it's not only women. And I'm happy to say that there are men, and there's also queer people involved, and it's not just things that women are doing. And I would totally degender this aspect. Or let's say the motherly idea of caring, right? So for us, it's a way of engaging in the world. So it's like politically charged. I would guess, yeah.
I wanted to, if I may, just share a few points with regard to your remark. Before I do that, there's just one thing that I realized I forgot to mention, is that the whole point about far-right ecologism is that we're talking about a spectrum. So it is very difficult to put people like Maciej, Krzysztof Bosak and Alicia on the same ideological, in exactly the same position in the ideological spectrum. and therefore thinking in terms of spectrums may be also helpful in addressing this issue. A year ago, I remember giving a presentation in Warsaw on the ecologically, so on the gender aspect of this far-right ecologism in Poland, because I realized that it was particularly pronounced there, that there are actually quite a few female leaders, not only female leaders, but actually leaders who, believe it or not, wouldn't identify as, you know, along the lines of binary gender dimensions. And they were very active in these nationalist movements. And not only they were active, but some of them were actually leaders. And actually Alicia is one of them. So I think that our own assumptions about how these actors operate are usually wrong. And therefore we need more engagement actually with these actors, much as that may sound as, you know, an unwanted experience in life. And for some of, you know, for some of our listeners, I understand that it is fully understandable and acceptable. But at the same time, such knowledge is important in order to better grasp this very messy image of the gender perspective in the far right, not only with regard to environmentalism, but also with the aspects of other policies.
Okay. Yeah, I will say something from my field, from my backyard, let's say, because I'm active on the field of energy, because this is like the most urgent field to cope with when we think about tackling climate change. So when we see in Poland, and I'm not sure if everywhere is like that, but when we see people deciding about energy, about mixed energy in this country, we see only men. Yeah, it's true. But when we watch people that are commenting, the reporters in Poland, they are mostly female. So this is a very funny situation that decision makers are mostly men, and people that are challenging their decisions are mostly women. And I don't know why, but something why it happens like that. But it is something really thoughtful. Yeah, so we had this observation. So another thing is that we are trying to go to another system. Let's change system, not the climate. Yeah, and when we are thinking about the field of energy and changing the centralized energy system and thinking about giving energy, giving power to the people, as we used to say, and really literal power, we are thinking about local communities and to taking the possibility of taking by the local communities the responsibility for their energy, because who has the energy actually has a power, and this is energy in a different aspects. You can think about electricity, you can think about heat, or you can think about food, because food is also the form of energy. So when we are thinking about this community and who actually is a community, it is men and women, and creating community and the gender and people that are taking care for community and and in our country, especially in our country in Poland, which is not so popular because of their ability to organize and to organize in the grassroots movement. We are actually very disorganized nation, and huge problems with trust to each other. So I really hope that women and men could communicate with this possibility to create community. Maybe this is of course stereotypically identified with women, but I'm sure that everybody actually has it in a bigger or smaller extent. So to create community, to devote to taking responsibility and the power to change the world, and this is my field. Yeah. And I think that in Poland, mostly women singing, so they are not so shy, and they are in my choir, most women, only one man, but singing beautifully.
Edith, would you like to add something?
So I'm the last. I think it was pretty much said everything what I would also address. But in our case, we would very much like to think like post-gender, and we do. But at the same time, it is kind of striking that some of the art collectives and or organizations which are like less institutional and non-hierarchical, nevertheless are at least in art world, art scene led by females. That's undisputable. So maybe I'm not. This is just a speculation. Maybe the males stay with the idea, with the institution as we knew it for longer, and female, maybe they sort of stepped in more openly into like the new formats of collective and sharing practice. But as much as it sounds like a cliche, I would say that the Czech scene is sort of present like this. And also like all the history of feminism, we had to digest really fast in like the post Velvet Revolution era. So it's kind of this overlapping sort of phases of like long-term development from the 60s. It really happened within a few years. So maybe it's this also is the result, but that's how the situation is with us. But we of course work within because we are in the core of the organization. We are women, but we work widely with like the non-binary public and cooperators. So
the other thing I thought there were quite interesting overlaps, but also significant differences, especially in terms of, for example, of practice of occupation or taking a space, is the different settings, the different spaces that you took over. And I wanted to ask you about that, but also, how do you think these particular spaces or settings shaped the communities that you were trying to form or keep on forming through these occupations, let's say?
I don't know, we're keeping the order.
You don't have to.
For us, as you've seen in the images I've shown, we are in a public infrastructure. So this was a space that was close to the public. And one of our, let's say, acts was to negotiate the opening of the space, building on these long legacies of Berlin, let's say, interim uses, right? I don't know if you've been in Berlin. There is a long history, and I think this is important to mention, and that's why I say that we build on this legacy, because although it was quite challenging and a lot of work of convincing authorities, this is a piece of infrastructure that is owned by the city of Berlin, but is managed by a private company, and then there is the water company that's it's in charge of the, let's say, technically of this infrastructure. So there was a lot of stakeholders that were kind of acting on that site, which was closed. So I mean, part of our engagement with the city is opening these sites and bringing, let's say, layering different narratives, right? To what are these spaces, how these infrastructures that are public should remain open, and how can we hybridize them? Because this is they were monofunctional, right? They were providing a specific function: collect water, take it, collect rainwater, and take it to the canalization. And when we open up the space, and start layering program, public program, cultural program, arts, education. This was another way of hybridizing the infrastructure and creating this public common space, I would say. That's absolutely a position. So this is, and the other thing that we realized by being there the first year was that we wanted to explore the complexity of the site. So you're there, you're with rubber boots. It looks like a oasis in the middle of the city. We're in the middle. This is a very urban situation. When it's in the middle of the city of Berlin, it's in Kreuzberg, and then you enter there and you see this water, and it looks like, you know, you're in the middle of, I don't know, an island. And then you walk in and you start smelling a bad smell, because if it's too hot, then the water it's polluted, it's rotting. And then you go into this, we have an army of rubber boots, and then you wear them and you go in, and then you realize that actually there is, you know, a concrete bed under your feet, and that there is mud that has been accumulated there, and that is ever changing. So this is the complexity that we wanted to keep and that we want to explore, because this is one example of this, you know, of the complexity of the world that we live in, right? Things, as you said, Balša, that there is a spectrum, right? There is no nature or culture, and this is what we try to explore through the programs that we do on site. One challenge has been, because you also asked about how the space shapes the public and our audiences, and how do we build community. We understand ourselves as a project that has a site, but we understand the site in a, let's say, in a multiplicity of scales. So we don't think about the site only local in the square, you know, what surrounds us, but we understand that this is a site that is what surrounds us. It's the city of Berlin, it's Europe, and it's a planet as well. We try to exercise the thinking, at least, also to avoid, you know, this idea of, you know, the local and the global as two disconnected things or to oppose things, but to try to understand that in, let's say, thinking or following the planetary turn. Yeah, I don't know, I was speaking too much. But maybe in terms of the audiences, and I think this is one of the challenges that we have, is that we are, let's say, a very, let's say we're working towards becoming a more intersectional place, that it's open and welcoming to let's say, to other communities, so that we want not to be host and represent our own identities, but it's a place that others can also appropriate and use. And it's challenging. It's a very wide space, even though, like, we are a group, there is a group of very much engaged feminists there, trying to bring this intersectional, let's say, attitude. It has proven to be a challenge to be open, or that other groups feel invited and addressed. And I think this is something that we have in mind, and that we, through programming, try to, yeah, let's say, mitigate in a way.
Edith, perhaps you.
Yes. I know. Maybe when I started to study the land and the commons, I sort of started to do that in a brown fields, because I felt like this is something which is really close to us, being in a city. And so, and then later on, I found that the diversity is really more compressed in the woods, actually, which seem to us to be the metaphor of you know, sharing, and metaphor of care, and mycorrhizas, you know, and helping plants, helping mushrooms and interconnection and wood web and these kind of things. But at the end, the woods are kind of really deforested these days, and the monoculture is keeps going, even with the history, how the deforestation is happening, so that therefore we chose the woods to be this ambivalency of the woods to be our land and a place to speak from. And also really important for us was that we moved the offices from the city to the land and close to the village, and try to hook with the people from the village and with their knowledge, and also their as Balša said, their politics, because it's really interesting to also have these political discussions with people around us, which are not already in our circles or intellectuals, and also bring it together with the international public, which is also really challenging. I think even within the language situation, and also with the situation of the COVID right now, because like this last symposium, we have to reduce to the national participants, which was really it was like a big reduce for us, but at the same time it was also an interesting thing to do it more locally. So there are quite a lot of issues. And then also interesting thing about the community itself, it's not really a community, because we don't have any like rules or any expectations, so people hook up and dealing whenever they want to, because we don't want to in this like precarious situation we live in, we don't want to sort of make them even more precarious or to to abuse their time. And so the situation of the community is really fluid, like whoever wants to invest, they invest, whoever wants to step by, then they can choose the energy which they invest in the project. So this is also some interesting thing we have to learn.
I'd like to add.
I could perhaps just add a very minor point, how your basic questions on understandings of raise different understandings of space and occupying particular space, and it just rings different bells to only to, I guess, to four of us. In my sense, of course, it makes me think about positionality in my research. So first thinking about the space that I occupied as a researcher, and I obviously entered something which was an unknown terrain to me, but then again trying to think from the perspective of the people that I encountered, that I spoke with, how some notions that we and some understandings of environment in this whole relationship we take for granted, right, are not really that clear to whoever we may be talking to. So the idea that environment can have its borders is obviously not something I believe any one of us would endorse. borders in a sense of national borders. But at the same time, it sounds very strange how, when you listen to justifications that are going along those lines, you realize how actually such worlds can be envisaged. And that not only points to different worldings and, in an ontological sense, but it actually points to very different conceptions of space. And this is basically just the point that I wanted to articulate here.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that also the way you think about taking up a space also presupposes, I think, or influences thinking about the sort of community that is there. It is different to occupy a space for a strike, and the community of protesters is very different to people who inhabit a certain area and try to live in it and transform it while being part of it. So again, I completely agree with you that this act of being in a space or taking a space with others, the way these takeovers happen also affects the community that we think about. And actually, this is something I wanted to ask you, especially from what you, Rosario, talked about, but also Edith. It's the question of sustenance of the communities that are created through these projects. Not only what sort of community is envisaged or practiced, but also how do we make it sustainable in many different understandings of the word.
Can you ask, sorry, I didn't hear the question very,
sorry.
Can you repeat the question? It was about the sustainability of our communities?
Yes, in a sort of, when you take a space, for example, with your project with the Floating University, or with Monika's climate camp, or the community of people who come together to perform, create something, how do you sustain these communities in a sense, make them last, make them livable, make them sustainable in that sense?
Well, first, I must say that we started as an art project, as a temporary art project of 6 months. That's normally the Trojan horse strategy of convincing authorities to let you occupy a space that it's not supposed to be occupied in that way. And then you need to prove them that in these 6 months that they gave you to do your crazy project, which you get funding from different sources, they're not funding it, that it can be great. So first there is that needs, let's say, that first step to create what it could be a supportive community that you can live. So what happened after these 6 months is that instead, normally we would take everything down, leave the space and move to the next project, is that having in mind this idea of sustainability and building structures that are, like, let's say, supportive for us in longer terms, the temporary is great in terms of opening doors and opening imaginaries. But we were also, especially in cities like Berlin that are under heavy attack from capital, and especially when it comes to land and land use, we were interested, of course, in staying. So what we did was create an association, a non-for-profit association, so a legal body that would allow us to stay, which was an interesting change for us, finding a form that it's not an institution, but it's a form of organizing and coming together. This brought together 42 people, individuals, that today are the Floating University Association. And it proved that, and then, sustaining that is not easy, because we all are doing other stuff on the side, right? We do funding applications, and sometimes we're lucky and sometimes not. At the moment, like last year, we had no funding. But this year now with Corona, because we're an open air space, and the Berlin Senate for Culture is very, very interested in that, convening culture amidst the pandemic. So finding spaces that can allow culture and art to happen within the regulations. We were very lucky to be one of these, let's say, spaces that could provide this. So it takes a lot of love and dedication and care from all these members that we do our work half paid, half ad honorem. We do a lot of hours which we give into the association. And I think we have an engagement with ourselves and also with the kind of city that we want to live in. And where this is what we're engaging now in trying to build structures that let's say build beyond the project logic, this kind of, you know, cultural, you know, the hamster wheel of the funding application, and that allow us to build knowledge that is sustainable as well, but that allow us also to, some might leave and then the next ones can continue. This is one way, and the other way is trying what we're doing right now, and it's trying, as I said before, is inviting others to come and use the space to provide an infrastructure that allows others to have different kind of engagement. So it's about building different points of access, I think, to people that are, let's say, long-term and engaged, some of them that are less engaged, and that to have a variety of users and users. Yeah.
I would maybe add something about two last questions about conservation, about conservatism, or let's say this is conservatism, and about occupying and sustainability. So from my point of view, activism is so unsustainable way of living. Where, like, if you want to be an activist, you have to just be very, very fast, so intensive acting person that actually is totally unsustainable, because actually we are trying to be hand in hand with people that live in a very effective and very, let's say, destructive way. So if they are fast and they want to destroy the earth fast, we have to be faster, yeah, and to act and think faster than them. So this is totally unsustainable. When I'm watching my friends in different NGOs and different grassroots movements, I know that is totally unsustainable, and I would like to have this opportunity to live in a sustainable way. But maybe one day I will find a way, and then I will teach others, or maybe somebody will teach me. Another thing is about occupying. I would try to make a bit to reverse it a bit. When I'm working with Client Earth and we are trying to hack actually the law and to use strategic litigation to change the legislation, to change the law in our country or in other countries, we see this strange situation that the law written one day, long time ago, could be interpreted in completely different way today. So we see that the law is not changing, but actually the usage of this law could be changed after 5 years even. So it's visible that the letters, that the texts that are written in our constitution on other legislation could actually stay the same, but the perception of this law could change totally. And if there is a huge pressure from downside from the society, actually the law could be treated completely reverse. And this is something that I perceive as occupying actually something that is very conservative, like law. We don't have sometimes to change the law, but we have to make a huge pressure on people that are actually on judges or people that are using this law, and we can occupy actually this very conservative space as law. So this is something for the previous question, and I see huge possibilities, huge opportunities in this way of thinking, that we can hack the space, but we have also can hack the minds and law.
I'm not sure if you either are frozen or do you want to add something, or?
Well, I can hear you. Maybe about the sustainability, our situation was a little bit different, I think, because we really wanted to build something sustainable, because we started to cooperate with the Academy of Permaculture, and we wanted to create this kind of an environment which will stay sustainable, but the community could change like all the time. Like we would like to have the space also to new members, and to sort of incorporate in the include in the program new activities as well, even though we are still like a young project. But it's the same. I have to say that as Monika mentioned, that we also are not really sustainable as the leaders, because we are all quite burned down as well from like all the things we do, and the sort of anxiety which we have in the title sort of got us already. So maybe that's the way it was the starting point for us to create a space where something will keep on going, even if we are not if we are not there, or we are not we don't have the energy, or we have like this kind of floating and non-stable energy. And it's quite interesting to study the way how the energies enter and leave the space. So that's for our project.
Yeah, the next thing I wanted to ask you about were something you've already mentioned, so the psychological ramifications, be it on the individual level, on the communal level. And I wanted to ask you, how do you think these can be connected with something that you, Edith, said, the sedentary form of protests as a way as a way of being, but as a way of acting that is seemingly inactive. So I wanted to ask you about this relationship that you see about the active acting, the possibility of acting, the producing new things, gaining political, recognition, or having more people in the protests or in the community, versus this more sedentary idea of just resistance. And yeah. So, okay, you don't, maybe I'll try to rephrase my question. Basically, what I'm trying to think about is few things. One thing is the form of action that can be both somehow sustainable in a sense of lasting, but in a sense of also well, psychologically not draining. Like to think about the creation of communities that can also be somehow supportive, if at all possible. That's one thing. And the other thing is the physical aspect of it. So the body relationships, like what sort of relationships do we, and how do we interact with other bodies, be it in human or non-human, and also how do you think about these contexts in the moment when we're all, again, probably for months, we're again stuck in front of our computers, fairly sedentary like a plant, but maybe quite differently.
I can have a take on that. I think the images I've shown, you've seen many different interactions of bodies, and in climate care we were inviting different artists and scientists to explore the basin and to explore on-site different types of relationships. So for example, very concrete also, yeah, we had a biologist studying the algae on site, and then with that doing a drawing workshop with kids that they were kind of exploring, learning what the algae is, and then they were drawing it. So through drawing, creating a kind of an empathy with the algae and learning about them. We also had choreographers experimenting with the vasing and the muds and the reeds and creating music with the nature. We had an architectural school building a nest made out of collected branches and living it there and seeing what happens when the rain comes and it washes it away and it brings it back. And we had a designer creating urban hives, so building hives out of dough and then placing them with the speculation that we could probably find a species that we could protect, and that by this, and this connects maybe to lawmaking, declare the basin under protection because there is a specific species that needs to be under protection. So a lot of that, I think, what we try to create on that side is also a space of support. And one of our, let's say, preoccupations was that the whole, let's say, situation that we find today as a society, as a planet, was sometimes very depressing, and that this situation sometimes creates an inability to act. And this anxiety, Edith, that you were mentioning. So for us, it's very important to create a space, a safe space there where we can find, where we can share, we can mourn. There was a mourning, like, a mourning, not mourning as in morning, but mourning with O-U. And there was a climate depression therapy, climate depression therapy session for activists, because they were sharing with us that after doing all this activism around climate issues, they were so depressed. I think what we need today, and just to close my contribution to this, is to create, to build these hopeful spaces and to come together and, yes, face the facts that we are extinguished, like we are in deep loss of our biodiversity, and but try to also bond with each other through art and through culture and through knowledge. And I think it's very important to come together. And yes, and I think we will pass the pandemic, and there will be again touch and and affection, this kind of warmth that we're all missing.
Yeah, perhaps the thing that is not as related to the, I mean, it is related in its own ways to the question, is the fact that from what I, of course, experienced as a researcher, so not really as an activist, or at least not as an activist in this particular field, in these particular settings, is that a lot of these movements were that I and actors that I encountered were short-lived, and when that imaginary line between being ideologically aware of something and being crossing the line of activism, so actually trying to do something about it, these moments, these sparks were usually relatively short. And what I could, for instance, notice is that a lot of, as I mentioned, a lot of the people that I encountered, that I spoke with, were younger, generally speaking, younger people. And even in their early to mid 20s, they already changed a few forms of organizing. So they were first in the general far-right group, and then they created an ecological section, and then that ecological section was dissolved. So they formed another one and another one. And I could see that they felt very experienced, but also in its own terms very old in the actual experiencing this environmental activism. So much as the fatigue of activism may be a bad thing, and it is definitely a bad thing, for these cases we could say that it was a good thing, because speaking more specifically about eco-fascist movements, they are no longer around. So there's always another side to the coin, and what I'm just trying to convey with the whole talk today was that one, if there is a single peril, if there's a single caveat of talking about the change that we're going through with regards to the environment, is that we should avoid essentializing phenomena, and that this plurality of perspectives always needs to be taken into account when thinking about desirable outcomes, desirable to the change that we're all together, we are all in this together, much as there are differences experiencing.
I also think that, as you mentioned, the sort of active activism and the more passive, it's interesting that if you sort of create the space, it sort of keeps the energy active itself, even if nothing is going on, like because this piece of land is a piece of land, but everybody as an image of the woods, everybody sort of keeps it in mind that it's constantly active. So even if you have bodies here relaxing, or if we do if we do not have this active formats of resisting, it still keeps this energy going. So I think it's this kind of reservoir of energy which could hide and show itself, but it's I believe it is still in there. So even though we have like different formats of practicing it, it could be as Rosario said, let's say meditation, or not even like doing anything, or like cooking, and there, or you can have activists talking. It's still keeps the same sort of energy going, I believe, even though the formats are really different and really passive active.
If there's something else you would like to add, this is the time, because our meeting is coming to its end. So unless there's anything urgent, I would like to thank you so much for the conversation and for your contribution. And I hope to keep the debate going with you and with other participants and with other people. Thank you very much. I think we're offline. Let's hope so.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you. It was great seeing you, and have a good evening. And let's stay in touch.
Bye.
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 Marcin? Okej, jestem sama.
Tak.
Dobra, dźwięki, wszystko okej?
Prawie. Wywaliło nam tłumacza w trakcie.
A,
No, ale na chwilę dosłownie.
no spoko, ja sobie sama wyłączyłam wideo na chwilę, zanim się ogarnęłam, także